Maple leaves in a glass jar. Have you ever saved a fallen leaf, pressed it in a book, just to remember a season you thought would last forever? Tonight we travel to a small New England town, where a widower named Paul finds an old glass jar of maple leaves on his porch, and discovers a letter that asks him to keep a promise made decades ago. This is a story about the vows we make, the mistakes we hide, and the way autumn light finds our faces no matter our age. Settle in, breathe, let the trees speak. Part 1. The jar on the porch. At 72, Paul Carlin had learned to move slowly, not because slowness was healthful. His doctor had been nagging him about walking more briskly, but because slowness was merciful. It pressed the noise away. When you go slow, you hear what the wind is trying to tell the maples. You hear the breath of the house itself. There is a sweetness in wood that holds years like rings. Paul, who had taught English at the high school for 36 of his 72, stepped onto his porch one Sunday in late October and found a glass jar set beside the boots he never wore anymore. The jar was the kind you might use for canning peaches, with a 2-part lid, and inside it lay maple leaves, 7 of them flattened against the glass, flaming red where the veins darkened to wine. They were arranged like a childhood thought, too precise to be careless, too simple to be pretentious. A narrow ribbon of blue thread circled the rim, and the handwriting on the tag made his heart draw back, then press forward again. He had not seen that hand in 50 years, and yet it came like a tune from a distant radio suddenly found again as you turn the dial. "Paul," the tag said, "you promised me once. It's time." There was no signature, only a small, faint ink line beneath the final E, as if the pen had sighed at the end of its work. He brought the jar inside as a man carries a candle against the dark. His house, a modest one with low, obedient eaves and a porch that faced a stand of maple and birch, had the fragrance of books and dust, a marriage that outlives the people who brokered it. He placed the jar on the kitchen table where he had eaten his meals alone since Diane died 3 years before. He touched the glass. His own face, reflected there, seemed a ghost floating over a red forest. The promise. He had made it by the bridge in Fairview, another October, the air tart with apples from a nearby farm, the sound of the river clapping the rocks. They were 19 and 19, the world both terrifying and plain, like a page before the sentence begins. He had said to Lena, no, Elena. He had always preferred the long music of her full name. If we get separated, if life turns wicked or merely dull, meet me in October by the Fairview Bridge, and bring me a red leaf so I'll know it's you. He had said it laughing. He had meant it as one means the spring. Youth is a soft door that swings open whenever a memory knocks hard enough. Paul sat and turned the jar until the leaves made a crown. He had forgotten, and yet not. He could call the number on the tag if there were one, but there was only blue thread, and that scrawled, "It's time." Across the table, his neighbor's granddaughter, Maddie, had left a stack of library books the day before. He had been helping her with essays for her nursing program. She was 35, brisk and dear. She called him Mr. C, and in her presence he felt the undignified urge to stand a little straighter. He picked up his phone, then set it down again. He could not explain this jar to anyone without loosening something that had been kept tight for half a century. The morning kept getting brighter because the thin clouds were a gauze that slowly unwound. A squirrel went past the window with ridiculous self-importance. A freight train in the valley made a sound like a groan from the earth itself. The jar's lid had been tightened not long ago. The leaves, though pressed, were not brittle. On the bottom of the jar, someone had stuck a small label. Fairview, October 28th. The date was a week away. He walked to his study and found the one photo of Elena he still allowed himself. It was the sort of photograph young men used to keep in their wallets. A booth picture, 2 frames, both slightly off-center. She was 20 then. Her dark hair fell onto her cheek as though the air had leaned against it. In the second frame he had attempted a serious pose and only achieved a kind of solemn humor. She had once said, "You will be good when you're old," as if goodness were a winter coat one grew into. He had married Diane instead, which had been an act not of betrayal but of survival. And then once survival had become habit, of love. He put the photograph back. He made coffee. He found himself listening for footsteps on the porch, as if the jar were a prelude, and the orchestra had yet to climb the stage. Finally, with the coffee gone and his patience worn to its noblest thread, he took a small notepad and wrote a single sentence. I will go. He set the note beneath the jar, a private treaty signed by a nation of one. There were tasks to be done before the going. He would need to ask Maddie for a ride, as the old Buick had long since surrendered to rust and a nest of mice with a theology of seat stuffing. He would need to visit the cemetery and tell Diane what he was doing. Not for permission. Love that endures does not issue permits, but for the tranquility that comes from speaking aloud the facts of one's heart, to the person whose silence is not absence, but a different listening. He walked to town along the shoulder where the leaves had collected, making a papery sound like whispers at a theater when the curtain begins to rise. The Fairview General Store was still itself. The jingling door, the aisle where you could find both birthday candles and bait, the old clerk whose hair was the color of road salt and whose opinion on everything was the same. Well, that's one way. Paul bought a small roll of blue thread and a pack of blank tags. He did not know why, except that a man in the first pages of a journey is always buying something ordinary that will later become symbolic. At the post office he turned, and there she was. Not Elena, of course, for that would have been indecently theatrical, but a memory of her, called down by a woman walking out with a parcel. The woman's scarf was the same shade of red as the leaves in the jar, and the wind lifted it so that it seemed to reach for the maples as a child reaches for a mother. The woman was perhaps 60, with that brave carefulness in her posture that says, I have learned how to keep going. Mr. Carlin, she said. Her voice had the scratch of a person who has laughed too much and smoked a little and wept properly and stopped at last. I'm looking for your place. Maddie said I'd find you in town if I missed you. He knew her. It took a second, but he knew her. The way a melody returns not as you heard it first, but as you sang it later, alone. Ruth, he said. Ruth Delgado. She had been in his sophomore class last in the year 2001, a girl who wrote essays like letters to someone she hoped would write back. I volunteer at the hospice now, she said. There's a woman, Elena Korunsky. She asked me to bring you this, and she passed him an envelope with the quiet assurance of one who carries the last message from the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the lines of handwriting as spare as November trees. Paul, it said, I kept our promise. I'm nearby at Brookside Care. Come if you can. Bring October with you if there's any left. Beneath the words, a little ink leaf, drawn with a hand that remembered 3 veins and forgot the rest. He stood there while the door jingled and the clerk said to no one, Well, that's one way. Is she? He began. 80, Ruth said quickly, then softer. No, 79. But she's small, like 80 is trying her on. She knew you'd count. It was a kindness he had not earned. He found as he walked home that slowness had been replaced by something else, not haste exactly, but the look of a man whose heart has begun to pack for travel. The jar on the table waited. Outside, the trees made their ancient sound, a low applause for whatever the human spirits below them were finally brave enough to attempt. Part 2, Brookside. Brookside Care sat at the far edge of town where the road turned narrow and the hills let themselves be ordinary again. Paul had not been out that way in months. Maddie drove him in her small car that smelled faintly of coffee and wintergreen gum. She had listened without interrupting as he told the story he had never told her, a story that required him to be 19 again, and naive in a way he could not fully imitate. I promised, he said at last, the way an older man must explain to the practical kindness of a younger woman why he is about to step into a room that will remake him. Then we'll keep it, she said. I'll wait in the lobby. You take your time. She put a hand on his shoulder before he got out, a gesture unashamed of its tenderness, and he felt that the world had not become as small as the news always tried to tell him. Inside, the place smelled of lemon cleanser and something floral that fought back bravely against the inevitable. A nurse with calm eyebrows greeted him and said, "Paul Carlin, she's been waiting." He followed a corridor where photographs of the town in different decades hung in humble frames. The mill when it still drew strength from water, Main Street before parking meters, the Fairview Bridge in winter, a white rib across a sleeping animal. He paused at the door because pauses are what keep us from saying things we cannot unsay. Then he went in, and there was Elena, propped by pillows the color of rain. Her hair, once ink dark, had accepted gray the way a coastline accepts fog. Reluctantly at first, then with a certain rude grace. Her eyes, however, were the same as the booth picture, attentive, almost amused by his caution. "You've arrived," she said. He held up the jar, foolishly, as if it were an offering. "I found your leaves." "I wanted you to have October even if you're late," she said, and there was in her voice no accusation, only the arithmetic of years. She held out her hands, and he took them. They were thin hands, veined, the wedding ring, not his, glimmering like a small, obedient sun. "You look exactly as I once imagined you might," she said, "like a man waiting for a train that's already at the station." "I didn't know," he said, and had to stop. "Of course not," she said. "We build our lives from what we can carry. We let the rest become weather." They spoke first of small things because small things protect the larger ones, as hedges protect gardens. How the town had changed and hadn't, how the winters were different, or else he merely felt them more. How her father had kept his accent in his pocket, like a coin he sometimes turned over and sometimes spent. How his classroom had smelled in late May, when the windows were open and the seniors sat with their shoulders already half turned toward the door. "I married," he said. "Her name was Diane. I loved her. She died 3 years ago. Brain aneurysm. It was morning. I was making oatmeal like a dutiful man. She was reading a recipe she never got to finish. I married Michael," she said. "He was kind. He listened to jazz the way other men go to church. The first time he held our daughter, he apologized to her for the world and promised to make it better. He kept as much of that promise as any man could. He died 10 years ago. I thought the pain would unmake me. It didn't. It just turned my edges. They were quiet for a time, listening to oxygen breathe, to a cart roll by, to a bird, a sparrow perhaps, try the thin hedges by the window. I kept our leaf," he said, "for a long time. Then I made the mistake of spring cleaning and obeying some article about letting go. I missed the leaf. The mess returned. I kept all the leaves," she said. "Every October I pressed one. I told myself, if he comes, good. If not, I will have a jar of cheap rubies and the knowledge that I didn't mock what I once believed." She nodded toward the bedside table where a second jar stood, the leaves darker, more brown than red. "These are mine. Yours belong to you now." He laughed softly. "I remember your father's hands. He fixed radios. He could persuade a little box of stubborn parts to sing. He said music is just discipline that learned to dance," she said. "When he died, I found a schematic he never built. It meant nothing and everything. I kept it. Then I lost it. Then I remembered it so often that it might as well have stayed." "You wrote to me?" he asked suddenly. "Back then?" "I did," she said, "twice. Then not again. I heard you were engaged to Diane and understood at once. You chose the path that would make you good when you were old. I was not the path. I was the river beside it." He reached into his coat and drew out the photograph. He had brought it because he had to show her that he had indeed tried to be that young man's keeper. She touched the edge, careful not to smudge the past. "We were true," she said. "Once. That is something. I'm sorry," he said. He meant it for everything, for the years he had not come, for the letter too late, for the comedy of human plans. She looked at him as a mother looks at a child who has finally understood the nature of rain. "I'm not," she said. "We built different houses, you and I. We tended different gardens. Now we've met on the road that runs between them. I am satisfied with that." When he left the room, he found Maddie with a paperback open on her knee, though she had not turned a page in a while. "You all right, Mr. C?" she asked, and he realized with some astonishment that he was. "I will be," he said. "She's as I remember, only more so." On the drive back, Fields went by with the serene patience of animals that have decided to forgive humans everything. "You know," Maddie said, "in the hospital where I train, I see people regret wild things. They regret the missed wedding and the daughter they stopped speaking to and the boat they never bought. But there's also this other regret no one expects. They regret how little they let themselves be happy the days nothing special happened." "Turgenev said something like that," Paul murmured, then laughed at himself for the vanity of quoting. "He said we don't know how to be grateful while the sun is shining." "That sounds right," she said. "Tomorrow do you want to go again?" "Every day for a while," he said, "if that's not too much." "It's October," she said. "There's plenty of color left." That night he took the jar to the porch and set it in the square of moonlight that came through a gap in the birches. He sat with it like a man sits with a watch he has forgotten how to wind but cannot bear to throw away. A moth came, did its frenetic arithmetic against the glass, then left, perhaps satisfied that it had made a point. He thought of Elena's phrase, "the river beside the path," and felt foolishly and also not that he had finally learned how to read a map he himself had drawn. He slept lightly and woke with the softness that follows weeping one did not perform. When morning came, it was not a trumpet but a hand on the shoulder. Part 3. The Letter in the Attic. News travels in small towns along routes that existed before roads, through the air at the diner, across the chalk dust of old memories, between the fingers of barbers. By midweek, 3 people had told Paul that they'd heard he was keeping a promise, which in Fairview carried the same affectionate awe as learning to bake bread. He smiled and nodded and bought apples. Maddie could not drive him that day. A double shift had taken her hostage. He called Ruth instead and found her willing, more than willing. There was in her a current that moved toward care, the way some rivers move toward the sea. On the way to Brookside, she spoke of her son, Luis, 8. He asks me if the moon is lonely. I tell him it has the tides. And of her mother, who had decided at 70 to plant dahlias with the seriousness of a new language. Elena was sitting up, a book on her lap, the oxygen humming with its insect patience. "I brought a present," Paul said, placing a small tin of black tea on the table, "from the store that still smells like hammers." "Elixir," she said, smiling. "Pour it over me and watch the gray retreat." They drank from paper cups because this was America, and we had learned to accept paper between our hands and the things we love. He told her about the photo display in the hallway. She told him that the night nurse sang quietly when she thought people were asleep. "Do you remember the house on Turner Street?" she asked at last. "The one we almost rented when we were going to be reckless together?" "I do," he said, surprised at the completeness of the recollection. The porch too big for the body of the house, the stair creaking at the 3rd step, the attic window round as a question. "We decided we couldn't afford it. We decided 32nd birthdays were more likely than miracle checks." "I drove by it last year," she said. "The same woman owns it, Mrs. Harrigan. She keeps her rent low for teachers and nurses because once, when she was young, a landlady forgave her 2 months and saved her life." Elena reached for her purse, found an envelope and handed it to him. "Go there," she said. "The attic. There's a loose board under the round window. I wrote you a letter in 1970 and hid it there when I lost my courage to mail it. I want you to have it now, not because it will change anything, but because we left something unfinished and I would like the table cleared." He wanted to argue that nothing needed clearing, that they had forgiven the past by living it out, but gifts demanded acceptance. The proper ceremony is simply to bow. He told Ruth. They drove to Turner Street with its modest oaks and the habit of being lived in. Mrs. Harrigan opened the door with an expression that suggested she liked whoever knocked because she had chosen to. "Attic," she said when he asked. "Of course, I always thought that board was not so much loose as accommodating." The stair complained, remembering past boots. Dust made a kind of quiet snow in air that had no business holding weather. The round window peered at them like a curious child. Paul knelt and felt the board give. Beneath it lay a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. the kind of weatherproofing you undertake when you doubt not the rain, but yourself. He opened it while Ruth pretended to inspect the rafters. A good pretense is a form of mercy. The paper was thin, the writing thick, as if emotion had weighted the pen. "Dear Paul," the letter said, "I am writing because I cannot stand the ache of cowardice. You will marry Diane, and you should. I have met a man who keeps time honestly. He does not borrow from the future. I will choose him. But I need you to know that choosing is not the same as forgetting. When I walk by the river, it says your name the way water says stone. When I hear a train, I think of leaving. And then I think of you telling me that leaving is not a virtue when it is merely escape. You steadied me. You are in my kindness. Forgive the parts of me that are in your sorrow. If we meet again, let it be like October. Bright, brief, sufficient." He folded the letter, then unfolded it again because the lines wanted to breathe. He did not weep, but felt the preparatory weight shift in his chest, as when a house adjusts tonight. "Do you want a minute?" Ruth asked gently. "I've taken 50 years of minutes," he said, smiling. "We should bring this back to her." Mrs. Harrigan refused money for the intrusion and instead insisted he take a jar of her pickles. "Life is brine and sugar," she said. "You need both." At Brookside, Elena listened as he read the letter aloud in the voice he used sometimes for poetry when he taught. Words gathered themselves at the edge of silence and refused to step off. "I am glad," she said simply when he finished. "If I had mailed it, it would have been a wound. Hidden, it became a seed. Don't look at me like that, Paul. We are old enough to forgive our metaphors." "You are braver than I," he said. "I was braver after," she answered, and they both understood. That evening he went alone to Fairview Bridge. The river below did what rivers have always done. It agreed to hold the sky for a while. He leaned on the railing and remembered the exact scrape where a boy had carved initials, and the town had allowed it to remain like a token of ordinary guilt. He took one of the leaves from Elena's jar and set it on the water. It moved, then hesitated in the eddy, then found the current, then did not look back. He had never been a man for magical gestures, but some gestures are simply grammar. You put the leaf on the water because the sentence needs a verb. A soft sound behind him, a footstep. He turned, half amused at his own readiness for miracles, and saw Maddie out of uniform in a sweater the color of old moss. "I thought I'd find you," she said. "My grandmother used to say men go to bridges to see if they need mending." "Do they?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said, "but sometimes they go because they are already strong, and the river wants to thank them." They stood, not speaking, because the best companions for a middle-aged grief are people who understand that words are not always the needle that mends. The air was colder. October had decided to accelerate. He shivered, and she touched his sleeve as one might steady a vase. In that moment, not romantic, not filial, something like the human promise moved between them, the vow that we will keep showing up for one another until the road says otherwise. Part 4. The Maple Sermon. On Sunday, after church, which he attended, not for belief but out of respect for the architecture of hope, Paul was waylaid by Pastor Avery, who had the good habit of leaving people more honest than they arrived. "I hear you're doing the work of October," the pastor said. "I bless that." "I didn't come for blessings," Paul said, half shy, half proud. "They come anyway. Blessings are like cats," Avery smiled. "They pretend to choose, but truly they belong to the porch." That afternoon in his yard, Paul began a task he had used throughout his life whenever thought grew too loud. He raked. The trees had surrendered almost without argument. Leaves fell like letters he could not read fast enough. He worked methodically, making piles that looked like small haystacks designed for children's games in towns that still practiced innocence. As he worked, he thought, not of Elena's illness, not of the letter, but of his students. He thought of the boys who had learned to soften their voices, and the girls who had learned to refuse apology. He thought of the veteran who had come back at 22 with a gaze like frost, and had melted slowly in a classroom where nobody asked him to be brave at the board. When he stopped to straighten his back, he saw a figure approaching. Maddie's grandmother, Mrs. Dwyer. 80 at Christmas and proud of it. I brought you soup, she said. Chicken with stars. It cures everything, especially the kind of sadness that's trying to be poetic. Stay, he said. Eat with me. Eat. I will, because I know how to accept a meal, she said. And they sat on the porch steps with bowls that steamed like old barns in first light. Maddie tells me you're visiting a lady who used to own your October. Good. The heart is not a store-bought thing. You can take it out and wash it and it won't shrink. I thought you didn't hold with metaphors, he teased. I hold with what works, she said. And I won't live to see 90 if I can help it. 89 is a fine round number. They laughed. After she left, he went inside and took from his study a book he hadn't opened since retirement, Fathers and Children, the battered classroom copy, margins carrying the arguments of 10 cohorts. He read the scene by lamplight in which young certainty meets old tenderness and does not know what to do. The pages smelled the way time smells when it has been asked to come back and speak. The next morning, Brookside again. Elena had color in her face, and there is a way you can tell when the body has decided to be generous a little longer. Read to me, she said, not the news, something that remembers how to breathe. He read aloud a passage about a meadow at evening, about the way grass maps the wind. She closed her eyes. I wanted to be a botanist once, she murmured. Imagine that, naming things you don't own. The Latin always sounded like prayer to me. You owned your daughter's name, he said. I borrowed it, she answered. We borrow our children, then return them to whatever sky they favor. Do you want me to call her? He had not asked before, out of respect for the privacy that survives even the body's confessions. She knows you're here, Elena said. She lives in Oregon. The distance is not cruel, only wide. We spoke last night. She told me the rain there is gentle, not like ours that arrives with a badge. Will she come? He asked. Not yet, she said. People misunderstand how endings work. We think they are dates on a calendar, but truly they are a season. We are in late fall. The winter will come when it decides and bring whoever it can gather. They sat with that. Outside, a volunteer raked the facility's small yard. The scrape was familiar, even cheerful. When we were young, Elena said suddenly, you told me I was impatient, and I resented you. Now I am grateful. Impatience saved me from 2 tragedies, and cost me 3 joys. The math is even. I was pompous at 20, he confessed. You were tender in disguise, she corrected. It's the best disguise. It fools even the owner. Ruth arrived in the afternoon, bringing Luis, who carried with him the way children carry weather, without effort, faithfully. He presented Elena with a crayon drawing of a tree that could have been any tree, and therefore was the right one. The leaves are talking, he announced. They're saying bye. They also say thank you, Elena told him. Leaves are very polite. On the way home, rain began, one of those October tempests that lick the windows and make the highways letter themselves in silver. Ruth talked about bills and shifts, and the way her mother had taken to humming old boleros while making oatmeal. Paul liked these plain details. They made a scaffolding for the day to lean against. That night, unable to sleep, he went to the porch and spoke aloud, which is only madness when you expect an answer. Diane, he began, you knew about Elena in the way wives know the history books their husbands keep in their bones. You never asked, and I never volunteered, but you understood there is a room called Before. I want to tell you, I am not leaving you when I visit her. I am finishing a sentence you began by allowing me to be the kind of man who doesn't flinch. He felt something loosen, not grief which stays, but the knot that grief sometimes ties around the simplest movements. Toward morning he dreamed not of Elena or Diane, but of his students standing beneath a maple as leaves fell around them like quiet applause. A voice, perhaps his, perhaps the world's, told them, "This is your sermon. Hear it while you can." When he woke, he decided to write a short letter, not a will, not a confession, but a page titled Maple Leaves in a Glass Jar, which he would leave in his top drawer. He began it with a line he had once told a sophomore who missed his father. The heart keeps the accents of those who speak there. He wrote for 20 minutes and felt, as he put the pen down, the peculiar peace of a man who has finally placed an object on the shelf where it belongs. Part 5, October 28th. The day named on the jar arrived like any day, reluctantly, then fully, like a shy guest who finds her joke and settles in. The trees had become almost bare, and the air had that clean metallic scent the old factory men used to call honest cold. He wore his best jacket, not to impress but to honor, and tucked the booth photograph in the inside pocket as one might carry a passport. At Brookside, the nurse said, "She's good today." He believed it. Sometimes the body opens a window so the spirit can wave. Elena greeted him with a small victorious smile. "We made it," she said. "At the bridge later?" "If you like," he said. "It will be cold." "I have a hat," she said. "I have always had a hat." They waited until afternoon when the lights softened and Fairview became a postcard nobody dares throw away. Mattie had arranged it with the staff. A wheelchair, a blanket, a thermos of tea. Ruth came too, and Louise, solemn for once, sensing ceremony. They reached the bridge. The river looked up at them with its patient eye. For a while no one spoke. The wind had learned a new trick. It tugged at the blanket and at the year. Finally Elena said, "Paul, would you read it? The letter we found, out loud." This time with the river listening. He did. His voice did not shake because this was not tragedy. It was gratitude's formal attire. When he finished, Elena nodded, then placed her gloved hand on his. "I once thought we were an unfinished book," she said, "but we were in fact a complete chapter. The rest is margin notes we've been generous enough to write." Mattie poured tea. They drank, and watched a gull attempt to bully a crow, an old drama with new actors. Louise asked whether leaves feel pain. Ruth said they might feel relief. "Like when you finally put down a heavy backpack," she told him. He considered this, then nodded with the seriousness of 8. As the sun declined, a polite guest leaving before it became awkward, Elena asked for a moment alone with Paul. The others walked to the far end of the bridge where the planks sound different because the river narrows there. "If we had run together then," she said, "what would we have become? Less kind," he said, smiling. "More beautiful, probably poorer." "Certainly poor," she laughed. "And maybe we would have made the same mistakes with different furniture. It doesn't matter. We chose as the people we were. I bless them." He leaned closer so she could see his face without strain. "I will visit tomorrow," he said. "If I am here," she answered, "I will be glad. If I am not, be glad anyway. There are worse fates than being found by October." She reached into her bag and brought out a small round object wrapped in tissue. He unwrapped it, a pocket watch, old, scratched, the glass slightly fogged. "My father's," she said. "He kept it even when he could not ask time for favors. I want you to have it, not because it is precious, but because it understands waiting." He protested briefly, because protest is the decent preface to acceptance. Then he put it in his pocket beside the photograph. "I'll keep it wound," he said. "No," she whispered. "Let it stop when it wishes. Some things keep better by being left alone." The wind pressed their coats against their ribs. He placed his hand on the jar that sat in her lap, the leaves trembling like small flags from nations that have no enemies. They remained that way for a minute that was both long and rightly brief. Then it was time to go because even good moments have their curfew. That night, Paul did not sleep. Not from dread, not from sorrow, from a strange brightness that made his thoughts walk the house like guests checking they had left nothing behind. Toward dawn, the phone rang. He knew. The nurse's voice was gentle and square. "She went easily," the voice said, "like a curtain that knows it must fall and does so only when the scene is complete." He dressed carefully, as you do when entering a room where the rules are still being written. At Brookside he found Ruth in the hall, her eyes rimmed with a fatigue deeper than lack of sleep, the fatigue of love having done its work. "Do you want a minute?" she asked for the second time in a week. "Yes," he said, and entered the room. The jar stood on the table, its leaves steady now that the air had decided to behave. He sat. He did not speak. Silence swelled to fill the form he had brought for it. He thought, not of sadness exactly, but of the precise shape Elena had carved into his life. We misunderstand loss. We think it removes when in truth it engraves. When he came out, Maddie was waiting, her face set in that firm kindness nurses wear as armor and as gift. She drove him home and did not attempt improvement. At his house she brewed coffee and put out toast like a priest offering crumbs that are somehow sacrament. "You'll be alone?" she asked. "I'll be with everything," he said, not to be clever but because it was exactly true. She kissed his cheek in the way daughters do to men who are not their fathers, and yet have earned the ceremony, and then left, leaving behind the mild disorder that means someone has cared for you. He took the pocket watch to the porch. It ticked, then paused, then ticked again, as if time itself were deciding whether to go on. He set it on the jar lid, and for a brief instant both the old watch and the pressed leaves seemed to agree on the hour, the right now. In the afternoon he walked to the cemetery. A maple had spilled its heart across Diane's stone. He knelt and brushed away the leaves because love is housekeeping. "I met an old friend," he told her. "We kept a promise. I have a few left. I will tend them." He told her about the watch, the bridge, the way the river had held the letter without drowning it. He felt as he spoke that soft, sturdy listening that had been Diane's greatest gift. She let reality be itself and you become yourself within it. On the way home, he stopped at the general store and bought a new jar. The clerk, faithful to his one philosophy, said, "That's one way," and Paul agreed. At home he placed in the jar a single leaf from his yard, bright still, though the edges had been bitten by air, and added a tag, "For whoever needs October." He left it on the porch in the square of sun where strangers might see it and understand, or not understand, but carry away something all the same. Evening came early, as it does when winter is rummaging in its drawers. He sat by the window, the watch quiet now, its face a small pale moon. He did not wind it. You cannot make time obey you. You can only agree to meet it politely at crossroads. He took up his pen and added one final line to the page in his drawer. "If you are reading this and you have a jar filled with the season you most loved, open it, breathe, then go to the nearest bridge and let the water finish a sentence you began." Outside, the birches lifted their white arms and the maples stood like old storytellers, whose voices had not dimmed, only softened. Somewhere in the town a boy practiced trumpet with the stubborn devotion of the newly infatuated. Somewhere a woman clicked off a porch light after deciding the night could find its way without help. Paul stood and turned off his lamp and, in the honoring dark, found his way to bed. He did not expect dreams. He expected morning, and he was right. Morning came quietly, its pockets full of small tasks, and he met it at the door with the dignity of a man who has remembered how to say thank you. If this story left a leaf or two rustling in your own memory, tap that like button. It really helps more people find these quiet tales. Tell me in the comments, what promise from your past still glows like October? And if you'd like more long, gentle stories about second chances, purpose after 50, and the seasons that shape us, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for spending this evening with me.